Hi, I'm David Vollmer, YieldPro Specialist with Harvest Land Co-op. Thank you for joining us today with the virtual answer plot. I'm here with Glenn Longabaugh from Winfield United, and we're going to talk about fungicides on corn and beans.
Outstanding. I'm Glenn Longabaugh, Regional Agronomist with Winfield United. David, what questions do you have for me today?
The last few years there's been, different options on timings on fungicide applications. I know there's been a move to do an earlier application.
Sure.
Application between V4, V5, somewhere in there. How long will that protect the corn plant?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically we would expect V5 applications to last the same amount of time as we would an R1 application, right? So typically you're looking at that 3 to 4 week window is about what you would expect from the strobilurin component of those fungicides.
Okay. We've always been taught that, tassel time right there around R1, that's the optimum time for that late application. What happens if we have weather issues, equipment issues, and that application is delayed a few days? How long after R1 is that application still going to be effective?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question also. So yeah, I mean, that ideal window is sometime after silking occurs, right? So when we flower, typically we're talking about tasseling, but the female part of the plant is the silk, and typically that comes in, the silks start emerging a day and a half after you see tassel emergence. And once we've got silks emerging, you've got fully about 10 days to go to R2, which would be blister. That's typically what you would consider brown silk. And that would be just that ideal window. But this conception that if we get it on later than that, we've lost the utility of the fungicide is really not true. And in fact, there's some, on certain pests, certain pathogens, even, relatively late applications still have a huge benefit to growers, depending on the pathogen, right? So we're talking about tar spot, we're talking about southern rust. I mean, those are diseases that come in later, and you can still see a huge benefit even from R3 applications.
That's good to know. we see yield responses sometimes from fungicides on corn where there's really not heavy disease pressure.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I sure can. So traditionally there's been these two timings, right? One has been R1 and the other has been this V5 time frame. When you look at R1 applications, typically we're looking at a much bigger yield response. And you get the bigger yield response because of you're protecting that plant during its most vulnerable time, right? In other words, when we get to flowering, we're about halfway through the plant's life cycle. We've already built the factory, right? From R1 on, we're not going to get any additional new leaves. And so you make an application at that time frame, it protects that plant as it goes into, building the factory's built, but it's going into full production of starch and photosynthate to fill that ear. Right? When we look at V5 applications, typically that plant is it's still growing actively vegetatively. It has less effect on yield. However, that timing is still really critical, and that's because what we do with V5 applications is we're cleaning that plant up early on, right? And we're hopefully delaying the onset of disease later in the season.
Okay.
So typically these diseases they live as saprophytes on the residue. I'm talking about the diseases that overwinter here. Right. That would be things like gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight. Those diseases live as saprophytes in this kind of alternate life cycle. They make the jump onto the plant, and then they go through, as obligate parasites, they go through a life cycle, and each time they sporulate, they infect the plant higher and higher. So that's what we're gaining. Your initial question, I'll get back to it, was around why do we see a response even in the absence of disease? And that really has to do with the strobilurin component of fungicides, right? These fungicides do other things besides just kill disease. It turns out that when you spray plants with a fungicide, it has this physiological benefits of actually stimulating photosynthesis. At the same time, it also reduces respiration. And,
okay.
And then, interestingly enough, it also does several other things, right? It reduces these programmed cell death compounds like ethylene and like abscisic acid. And so it really, when we have abiotic stress, these strobilurin fungicides tend to help with yield simply because of these physiological benefits.
Do some hybrids respond more to that application than others?
Yeah, great question. So, traditionally or historically, seed companies, those manufacturers would look at their lineup and say, this is a very healthy variety. It probably is not going to need a fungicide. Or here's a really unhealthy variety. It's going to benefit from fungicide. And yet at Winfield, we have a response to fungicide trial where we basically look at every product. We look at them corn on corn, we look at them corn on soybeans, and we test them physically. They are all treated with and without fungicides. And basically we have scores to predict which products are likely to respond even in the absence of disease, right? And so those response to fungicide scores, right, if we know it's heavy it's a really heavy fungal pressure season, then probably everything should be treated. But it's really when you have those years when you have less fungal pressure, how do you choose which product to spray? Well, we have that data.
So that's where our response to fungicide scores would come in.
Absolutely. Great question, David.
Switching gears a little bit, let's move to soybeans. Read a few things where people are splitting their fungicide applications on their beans. Is there much benefit to doing that?
Yeah, so if a grower is going to make one application of fungicide on soybeans, it really needs to be at R3, right? That is kind of the sweet spot. That's where you're fully into reproduction. That's when we have little 3/16 pods within the uppermost 4 branches of the top of that plant. But a few years ago, I was listening to some contest winners, and they were talking about making multiple fungicide applications, and it really dawned on me that maybe we're missing the boat on earlier applications. And so for the last couple of years, we've been doing some work with 2-pass fungicide programs and making that first pass kind of late R1, early R2, kind of that late June timeframe when those rows are starting to close up, right? When you think about soybean rows closing, there's something that happens at that time. And what happens is you've created an environment in that lower canopy that is just perfect for pathogens. So if we can make a fungicide application at that time frame and get the entire plant covered, it's kind of like making a V5 and an R1 application in corn, right? We've cleaned the plant up, we've created a nice environment to keep those lower nodes on the plant, because we know that the vast majority of soybean yield is held in the middle of the plant. If we can use fungicides to help put more pods on the bottom or the top of that plant, then it can be a big return for growers.
Good. Now on that later application at R3, can you talk about some of the benefits of adding maybe micronutrients or plant growth regulators at that time? Yeah,
that's a really good. So whether we're talking about R1, R2 applications, or whether we're talking about R3, R4 applications, right? We would almost always recommend that growers take a tissue sample sometime prior to making that application. So if a grower is going to make a fungicide application, it would always be his benefit to have some kind of competitive intelligence of what nutritional deficiencies might be kind of hidden, right? What hidden hungers does that plant have? And so typically the things we're supplementing with are manganese, boron, sometimes you'll see zinc. But it's typically manganese, boron, and probably copper in that order.
Okay.
And some of our guys that are, we have some folks within the YieldPro program that are really shooting for top yields. And one of the other things they need to keep an eye on is potassium, right? Soybeans are intensive users of potassium, and oftentimes we need to make in-season amendments of potassium. So yeah, great question. Lots of things we can do if we're going to go back and make a fungicide application. But the one thing we did leave out there was insecticide. There are critters out there that are holding our yields back, and one of those is stink bugs, right? And by the way, we're not saying that all integrated pest management is dead, right? If we've got aphids or something that can be controlled by beneficials, then we need to probably scout it pretty intensely.
Okay.
When we're talking about these hemipteras, these stink bugs, or coleopteras like Japanese beetles or bean leaf beetles, on those guys, really we just need to make applications and treat them prophylactically.
That sounds good.
Sure.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you for joining us today on the virtual answer plot. the code for this session is AP30. Thank you very much.